The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Hi, my name is Sonya del Peral. I'm from Nine Pin Cider Works in Albany, New York. And we're doing a series called New York Cider to educate our viewers about New York cider and New York apples. This afternoon, my guest is Karl duHoffmann. Karl is a principal at Orchard Hill Cider Mill in New Hampton, New York. He's also a board member with the New York Cider Association. Good afternoon, Karl.
Hi, Sonia. Thanks for having me here.
How are you?
I'm doing pretty well.
Good.
Very good indeed.
Good. Cider has always been an important part of the American beverage scene, and our viewers are hearing and seeing more and more about cider recently. What is cider and what's going on?
Well, I mean, in its simplest form, the base understanding of cider, and I think there's some confusion about it, and so people might be surprised to hear that cider is the product of the alcoholic fermentation of apple juice. Historically, all across Western civilization, the word cider refers to what essentially is like an apple wine. It's just instead of wine made from grapes, it's made from apples. In America after Prohibition, well, actually before Prohibition, as you said, it was cider was ubiquitous. It was everywhere. It was the most common alcoholic beverage. The planting of apple trees, it was an easy way to get, a quality sugar that was available every season that you could, press into a juice and then ferment in some barrels and keep around and have to drink at home. Especially in a farm setting, every farm has at least an apple tree, or two, or a little orchard where they could gather. And those were not for eating; those were primarily for the production of alcohol, historically. So that tradition sort of fell by the wayside a little bit with the move to the cities in America, because it was easier to bring grains to the city and then brew some beer. You wouldn't have to store as much volume. And so beer became a little more popular. And then the death knell for a long time for cider was Prohibition, especially in New York State, because after Prohibition ended, there was a whole set of laws that were designed to basically keep people from drinking. There was so there's a whole superstructure of laws designed to make getting alcohol harder, to make sure that people didn't make alcohol at home. And cider during that period, the word came to be associated with sweet apple juice that was fresh pressed on the farm. And so we have a whole tradition, and I grew up with it, where you'd go to the farm where the apples were grown, and you'd buy freshly pressed juice that wasn't filtered, so it was cloudy, and it had all the texture of like a fresh fruit flavor. And that's what a lot of people think of as cider. But it's just not. It's apple juice, but it is different than store-bought Mott's apple juice. And so now we have this tradition of sort of sweet cider and hard cider, which we need to speak about in order to make sure people understand that what we're talking about. But in almost all of Western civilization, the word cider is all you need to do that. Like, we don't say sweet wine and hard wine. Wine is wine, and cider is cider.
And so why is cider all of a sudden in the news or in the restaurants or in bars?
Well, I think it's a combination of a lot of factors, all of which I think are really exciting, and they're giving a lot of excitement to consumers and to the producers. First and foremost, I think people are more and more looking for very authentic products that come from with a sense of place. And so really nothing has more sense of place than cider. There's apple growers all over New York State, and they've all been making sweet cider for a long time. And it's a natural extension to then take that sweet cider and ferment it into high quality hard cider. That has been facilitated by a change in legal structure. For a long time, those laws, the Rockefeller laws that were put into place after Prohibition in New York, have functioned to basically suppress the industry in a way, make it very hard for small producers to get in, and also very hard even for hobbyists or people at home to make their own. That has slowly come unraveled, with the craft beer movement and the craft distillation movement and all the wineries, and then it's gained speed in the last few years on the national level, but also in New York State. I think Governor Cuomo has been very receptive. I mean, Senator Schumer and the people, the work that's been done under them at the agency level to be put into place laws that would allow people like you and I to start a small business tied to local producers of apples and producing a high quality local cider. It's just gotten a little easier.
So how does a consumer or one of our viewers begin to understand cider in terms of the sensory experience?
Well, it's an interesting thing because there's different styles of cider all over the world. There's different countries that produce different styles, and here in New York, you have a wide variety of ciders. So I think it makes a lot of sense to go and visit some of these producers. I think I think a majority of our producers in New York State in our cider association have tasting rooms where you can go and engage with the producers face to face, get the skinny on what they're producing and what their philosophy is. It makes it for a very enjoyable day, and oftentimes those visits can correspond with other activities at the orchards or at nearby venues. I think that's a great way to do it because if you don't go and you don't talk to the people who make it, you're likely to get a lot of different information that may not be accurate.
Is it like going to a brewery or a winery?
I think it's exactly the same. I think, I would most often, if you're going to a winery, it's at the vineyards, but not always. And so I think, with a brewery, it's the same thing, except that you might have apples outside. But the same experience where you can go, you can usually taste through a selection of their production, learn how they make it and why they make certain decisions, because there's a lot of decisions that need to be made when you're making a hard cider. The type of apples you're using, the type of fermentation you're going to undertake. Is it aged in barrel? Is it not aged in barrel? Do you allow bacterial fermentations to happen? Do you add any flavor adjuncts that might, make it like a raspberry cider or a hop cider? All those decisions, each of those decisions basically, when they're made, determines what the final outcome is. And as many cider makers as there are as many different decisions that they make, and therefore there are as many different sensory experiences that you could get. But I do encourage people to go to visit these places because these local businesses are using local apples, and by supporting them, you're going to encourage the growth of the industry and encourage those people who are working so hard with your presence, and then you will find out about all the different styles and flavors and approaches to cider making that exist.
What talking about styles, can you give a description of the range of cider styles?
Well, I mean, if I think back to when we started making cider, we had an idea in our brain of what we wanted to do, and that was to be very true to the apples that we had. And so we looked to old world production styles for some guidance. If you go to England, they have a variety of styles they make. They make some ciders that would be very, I think, recognizable to the American consumer. That sort of sparkling, lower alcohol, easy drinking, something you might get in a pub. But then in the West Country, they also have styles that were more like a still wine, no bubbles, high tannins, very dry, more challenging flavors. And so there's two examples. If you go to France, they make a style of cider that's usually low in alcohol and has some residual sugar, but a lot of funky barnyard aspects, and they use a special technique called keeving, which is very unique to how they produce cider. So that's a unique style if you taste a Norman or a Breton style cider. And then Spain produces some very interesting styles that are very oxidative, and they get a lot of volatile acidity. And volatile acidity is basically like a shorthand in winemaking term for acetic acid aromas that smell like vinegar. So they have these very challenging, cloudy, dry style ciders that they pour from on high. Germans and Austrians make very clean, pristine, fruit-forward styles of cider. So there's a lot of different styles, and I think if you go around New York State, you'll find examples like those, but then also examples that have been influenced by craft beer styles, where you can bring in hops and you can bring in flavor adjuncts, and then of course there's pears. There's a variety of styles that use pears to a portion of the fermentation or a lot.
So sometimes the pear cider would be mixed, the pear and the apple would be mixed together, and then other times it would be just pear?
Yeah, that's what I've seen. Sometimes it'll be 100% pear, but sometimes they'll just use some pear in the apple cider in order to bring some aromatic profile. And also, the interesting about cider is that, unlike beer, it will ferment all the way to dryness. And so you have to take special care in order to leave some sugar behind if that's your goal. And sugar does balance the acidity, and if there's tannins, it's a player in the game of flavor. So when you drink something that's very tart or has the bitterness of tannins, a little sugar is required to balance it out. But if you don't take care, the apple sugars will ferment all the way out. The pear actually has some sugars that don't ferment out. They're non-fermentable. So people will throw in some pear to leave a little sugar behind naturally. So there's different styles, again, depending on if you have pears.
So you're saying that all of these styles are found within this great state of New York?
I think I've seen, examples of almost each and every kind, or, some more than others. But yeah, I think there's producers who are working within certain traditions, and even you might be surprised at some big producers that produce one style. You might have, if you go to visit, you might find that they have some small releases that they've been experimenting in these different traditions that are only available at the tasting room. It's one of the things that we're working on for Hudson Valley Cider Week, is to start a tradition that every summer during Cider Week we have a cidery only release that is released during the Cider Week, so you can come and visit and discover what's new and exciting and sort of cutting edge that they're working on. And you might be tasting the thing that becomes their next big hit before anyone else gets to. So I think that might be a very good way to discover about some cool ciders.
So there's a lot of opportunities for our viewers to try various ciders. And does the association provide information about where all these cideries are?
We do. We have a website that is really just coming out, and we'll have all of our members with links and things that you can find them. There's also quite a few maps and magazines like the Cider Guide that are coming out. The Hudson Valley Cider Makers have put together a little map called the Ciders of the Hudson Valley that you can find. That's also connected to a website. And I see a lot of those guides along on the thruway at the stops, so you don't even have to plan too far ahead. Even if you're just already going down the thruway and you stop at one of those information places and you look, you're going to see a lot of resources to find us, and we're all online. So
of course
you can certainly find us there.
Well, that's handy, definitely. And has Taste New York, the Taste New York program, has that helped the message, getting the message out there?
Yes, I mean, there's been a number of partners who've really helped the Cider Association as a group and the members individually. I would say the Empire State Development Corporation, Taste New York, the New York Ag and Markets, and the Glenwood Center have all contributed time and resources to helping the Cider Association get these materials together to make them available to help get the message out. And the Cider Association itself is continuing on many fronts to sort of hone the message and to help the cider makers here kind of forge an identity that can be communicated in a way that I think we all aspire. We have big aspirations as cider makers in New York, and I think we're all working very hard to make that a reality every year in our cider production, and then to communicate that reality in a larger and more unified way, so that people in New York State, but also people around the United States, and then people overseas all start to hear about what's going on here, and the great potential that we think we have as a group and individually.
That's great news. It's great news for cider makers, and it's also great news for our farmers, is correct?
Well, we feel that there's a lot of benefit to working together with the local farmers. We think we share a lot of the same goals, and indeed, our efforts as cider makers is really very much dependent on their success as growers of apples and quality apples. And we are spending a lot of time, and we're actually asking for more help from, Ag and Markets and Taste and these resources to help direct research in order to identify cultivars that will work for making higher quality cider, that are more reliable for the growers to grow, to help our industry grow. So we feel there's a lot of synergy there where we can, as a group, benefit each other. And clearly, without apples, we can't make cider. And New York State is the second largest producer of apples in the country, and we feel certainly a quality leader. And I think part of the reason you're seeing all these producers pop up around here, and I should have mentioned that before, and it was part of my decision when we started the project, was, well, I'm interested in making beverage alcohol. What should I do? I love wine, I love spirits, I love beer, but I'm in New York State, and there's all these great apples. And when we started our project, we've been legal about 5 years now. When we started the project a couple of years before that, trying to get everything in order, there was only a handful of producers. Now, of course, it's exploded because of the legal, deregulation that we were discussing. But none of that would mean anything if we didn't have a great source of apples. And so I think our industry will become more and more of an outlet for those growers. And when you're a grower, you deal with a lot of inconsistency in nature. You get attacked by bugs. You get your best prices for apples that only look perfect. And so some of those problems can be ameliorated by, having an outlet like us, because the fact that the apples don't look good really doesn't mean anything once you've pressed them and fermented them into hard cider. So, quality apple that delivers great flavor and high sugar and good acid, as long as you have it, as long as it hasn't been destroyed by fire or pestilence, we can add to that their ability to kind of weather the inconsistencies, I think.
New York has a number of different weather zones. What happens when there's a bad year? Is the entire state out of luck?
It seems like it doesn't seem to be that way. I can't say that my expertise is in the growing area. My Orchard Hill Cider Mill is where we have 3 partners, and we each sort of take care of different aspects. And the partner, Jeffrey Soons, who is the grower, has, obviously we ask a lot of questions, and we're trying to learn about that aspect of it. And like last year was a pretty bad year for the weather for apples, and I know a lot of people had very bad harvests in the Hudson Valley, but I think up in the western area it wasn't so bad. And then even within the Hudson Valley, certain growers did better than others because, I mean, our orchards are situated on these limestone outcroppings. So there's like these big, huge like mounds of rock, and then very little clay on top. You know, and like they all have cuts through them where they've cut through roads. So there's like an orchard, and then there's a road. So it dips. So when it gets really cold, the cold and the frost falls into the dip, and it falls off and goes down to the river, and the trees kind of ride above it because it's raised up. So they avoid, like, the damage that they suffered was much less than, you know, if their orchard had been down on the plain, they would have gotten creamed. But that's why it's a 100-year-old orchard, right? Because it survived. You know, it's like, there's these things that. So yeah, I don't think the whole state gets hit the same way. Obviously, it doesn't preclude that the whole state couldn't get hit, but for different reasons, for different times, and that's my understanding of it. I'm certainly not an expert on that aspect.
Well, let's get back to where our viewers can find great cider. We've talked about the importance of visiting individual cideries and their tasting rooms, but where else can cider be found?
Well, I think that there's a lot of retailers and restaurants that are more and more supporting good cider. And I know that when you're looking for good cider, like if you went to my website, we list all the retailers and the restaurants that supply us, that stock us, and I'm sure Nine Pin does something very similar. And I would suggest that that's a good way to start. Like if you want to discover about cider, you don't want to go on a trip, you can say, well, who are the local producers that I've heard of, and where do people sell them? And if you don't find that your neighborhood restaurant or, you know, craft beer bar stocks good cider, it's an amazing thing when I go into a customer and I say, hey, would you like to sell this hard cider? People go, oh, well, no one asks for it, so I don't know if I should sell it. And so what I recommend that people do is that they go to their favorite places and say, why don't you stock some New York State ciders? I'd love to drink some of those. I'd love to learn more about those. Because we're all out going to these places, and we're all offering to say, you know, I'll come into your bar, I'll come into your restaurant, and I'll do a cider seminar, not with my cider, but with other ciders too. I'll taste 5 or 6 ciders, and I'll teach your staff about it. I'll teach your customers about it. But if the consumer goes and starts expressing more of an interest, people respond to that. So I think, you know, looking at our website to find, at the New York State producers' websites, to find where they are stocked, and you'll find that a lot of the same places are on a lot of people's website, because the supportive places, the places that understand it and are getting it, are supporting a lot of people. And then encouraging places that haven't gotten it yet to wake up to the opportunity. It's a funny thing, they always say a prophet's never welcome in his hometown. And I find that sometimes that's true. There's people who say, oh, well, it's from New York, it can't be good. I want to get the French stuff. I want to get the, you know, and then meanwhile, people are coming to my tasting room from France and going, I read all about your cider. I want to taste it. This is great. And then they're taking bottles home, you know, and so sometimes it takes a little time, you know. Napa Valley was, you know, never considered a serious place until it was, you know, and I think New York for cider production is on that pathway. And right now we're at the early adopter phase. So people who are early adopters, who want to be early adopters, should encourage the slow reactionary set to get on board.
And you've talked about on-premise venues such as restaurants and bars. And what if I want to drink cider at home? What if I want to create a little cider cellar in my basement?
Yeah, that's a great idea. And some ciders are really made for aging, actually. So some ciders would be you know, good for that, where you could start to lay a couple bottles down and see how they mature over the time. Well, there's retailers all over the state that are stocking good ciders, and the interesting thing about New York State cider is it can be sold in grocery stores. It can be sold in fine wine shops. So I would look in both of those places, because or in these kind of specialty beer shops where you can find a nice selection of good ciders. I think you'll find some in each of those places, and there's really good stores dotted around the state that are supporting the category, that you'll find a selection of seriously good cider. And I think as a consumer, I think I remember when I first started waiting tables, and White Zinfandel was a craze. People loved White Zinfandel, and then it went from White Zinfandel to Sonoma-Cutrer, like heavily oaked California Chardonnays that were very sweet, or not very sweet, but pretty sweet for a dry wine. And these kinds of trends come on, and it's like there's a communal development of tastes as people slowly go up the chain and arrive at like drinking real stuff. And I think we're going through that channel where people are sort of coming out of the White Zinfandel phase, like the Bartles and James cooler style ciders, and they're slowly developing towards ciders that are worthy of being at the table with your food. We had a tasting with the World Oyster Day in New York, and they had sparkling wines and cider and beer and whiskey all paired with oysters. And the person who put it together was tasting through everything, and they paired one of my ciders with the most challenging, funky, large oyster, because it worked really well, right? It worked better than the other more traditional pairings. So, be adventuresome. Find these good shops. Ask for, things that aren't necessarily always the same, and you'll find that there's a lot of reward to introducing these ciders in different venues. People think about cider as a fall venue, like something you drink in the fall, because apples, of course, you go to harvest the apples and pick your apples and want to drink cider. But cider is very refreshing. It's so refreshing.
It's a year-round drink.
I mean, it really is.
Yes. Well, we need to wrap up, Karl. It's been great to hear a little bit about the exciting growth of the New York cider industry, and I'm so happy that you came by. In this series, going forward, we will be interviewing other Cider Association directors to learn more about the New York Cider Association and New York Cider and New York apples. And we're just thrilled that you came in this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Sonya.
Thanks.